Welcome back to Old Fashioned Health. I'm your chef, Chef Jay, and today we're going to learn how to properly follow and go through a recipe. Many of you all sending your emails saying, "Hey chef, I just tried that recipe that you had online and it didn't come out as good as what yours looked like." So today we're going to help you fix that problem and go through thoroughly on how to properly read and understand the recipe so that you, as a wonderful customer out there, can prepare the great meals that we prepare here at Old Fashioned Health. Let's get started. So what I have for you today is just a sample recipe of an item that we're going to eventually make, and the recipe is called a quick yellow cake. Nice dessert, quick and easy, that you can make in your spare time at home for a good holiday and spice it up with any type of fruits or frosting that you care. So some of the key things that we want to look at when we're when we're reading a recipe. The title, of course, which we already went over. Next, the yield. Oftentimes, the recipe would say what you're actually making. What's the end result? It'll say yield 20, yield 30, or either the size of the dish. In this case, we have the option to either make a half sheet pan, which is a 9x13 pan. We see those often in the grocery, or two 9-inch round cakes, which we're familiar with seeing the 9-inch round cakes that we either make brownies in, or the double layered cakes that you can often get that are pre-made. So the next step that I like to do when I'm looking at a recipe before I'm about to make something is look at the meat, the nuts and bolts of the recipe. Now I don't even get into the ingredients yet. I just look at the steps. Why? Because oftentimes, just like many of us will go to the store, we'll buy one of those boxes, one of those beds you have to put together or a dresser you have to put together, and we pull out all of the ingredients, which would be the boards and nuts and bolts, and then take the rest of the box with the instructions and throw it to the left. And then we try to figure out how to make it, and it doesn't come out right. Same thing with following a recipe to come out with a great dish. So it starts off by following the first step. So the first step is to understand what we're trying to make. In this case, it states, take butter out of the fridge to soften and preheat the oven to 350. Now, oftentimes people will just go and they may preheat the oven and forget the butter, or pull out the butter and forget to preheat the oven, which are all crucial steps. Because once you're finished making your batter, you need to be able to go from your bowl to the pan to the oven, not making your batter, then it's sitting and then it's losing air while your oven is getting warm. Or you can't mix the batter with ice cold butter, because it takes a longer process to make it smooth and soft and warm to room temperature. So 2 key steps. Take the butter out of the fridge to soften, preheat the oven to 350. Now, for those that have a gas oven at home, I always say go at least 25 degrees lower, because the gas oven will get hot a lot quicker, and the heat is a little bit more stressful to the cake than it is in an electric oven. The heat in an electric oven is more consistent, it goes up and down, and there's no forceful air that's in there. Whereas with the gas will get hot very quick, and it's a little bit harder to control that temperature within a 5 to 10 degree range. So I always say, if it's 350, aim for about 25 degrees lower, so that would be 325, and your cake will come out just fine and perfect. Next step, prepare 1 9x13 inch pan or 2 9-inch cake pans with butter. It says grease them thoroughly with butter or baking spray. So thoroughly means well coated. Don't have so much spray to where you can fry chicken in the spray, and don't have so much butter to where you can take a biscuit or a roll and dip in there and still have butter left. Just enough to coat. You know, that's the lubricant, so that the bread, which is the cake, can release when it's time to take it out of the oven and it rests. Alright? So, after we do that, you can also, as an option, sift with a little flour inside, which is another lubricant for the cake to release. So you have your greased pan, and then you also took flour and dusted it And then make sure if you're going to dust with the flour, turn the pan upside down and just tap it to release the excess flour. Because if you leave the flour with the butter, then you're going to create something that's called a roux. Because that's what happens when you add fat and flour together. And we're not making roux, we're making cake. Going to use a hand mixer, alright? Use a handstand mixer to beat and soften butter. So, that means I need a mixer, whether it's a hand mixer or if you have one of those fancy KitchenAids, even better. Take our softened butter. Remember it says softened, which means the butter that we took out the fridge to set while we were dusting our pans and letting our oven get hot to the proper temperature of 350. Add it to our mixing bowl. It didn't say put it in the microwave and melt. It didn't say put it on the stove and melt. If you melt the butter, you come out with a whole different texture than you do when you have softened butter. When you have softened butter, the butter is there so that as the cake bakes and rises, it essentially moistens the cake at the same time and create a better buttery flavor, as opposed to the butter already melted. It can't baste itself because it's already melted into a liquid. Once the butter is softened, add sugar and mix together to fluffy. Fluffy is another term for saying airy. You're trying to whip air into the butter and the sugar so that it becomes light, right? Which helps your cake become light. Typically this takes about, I'll say 3 to 5 minutes, not long. You know, on a medium spin, doesn't take long at all. Add the eggs and beat until fluffy, incorporated, and light. So we go back to the fluffy and we go back to light. So what does that mean? You want to see foam. When you whip the eggs and it's fluffy, that means you're going to see foam. You're trying to whip more and more air. The more air you whip into the eggs, the lighter your cake's going to be. The eggs are heavy, and eggs are more fat. You're adding the yolk and the white, which is a little heavier. So you're adding more air, which creates the froth or fluffiness. Then you beat in the flour, the salt, the baking powder, and finally the milk. So we gradually went from solid dairies to wet to dry. All right. Now, when you add your dry, it says slowly mix together, then add milk. If you just pour everything in together, you're gonna have lumps. If you follow the direction and it says slowly add, which means take some time, slow down in our busy lives, and add the flour, then add the milk. And I like to stream in the milk. You know, take it, and on about a 3-second stream, it's okay. You may say, I just want to pour it all in, but no. You're making a beautiful cake. Once we've done that step, you also add the vanilla and beat everything together on low for 30 seconds. Then on high for 3 minutes. So the reason why you go on low in 30 seconds is so that you get the little mixture, and then on high, you're creating more air and thoroughly incorporating all of the ingredients. Now, make sure when you're whisking all these items together, you're using your whisk attachment, which is the big oval attachment with many different springs, you can call it, or spirals around it. Most of us are familiar with the whisk attachment for our cake mixers. And next, immediately pour the prepared pan and bake for 25 to 30 minutes, or until the top springs back slightly when pressed. Now, what I suggest is pour the cake in the middle of the pan. Don't go pour it around. Pour the cake in the center of the pan until it's about, a quarter inch, and then you pour the rest in the other pan, and then give it a quick shake so that it's even. All you're doing is shaking it like this so it's even. Alright? Then we put it in the center of our oven. So if you have 2 racks, put one in the center on the first rack and one in the center on the second rack. Now, to tell if the cake is done, I know you're saying, how do I know if it's springy? It didn't jump back. What do you mean springy? How is that? How can I tell that texture? So, what do? You go and grab some toothpicks, or if you like to cook out and you have some skewers, grab your wooden skewers. So, at the at the 20-minute mark, I suggest take your skewers or your toothpick and just stick it in the center of each cake and pull it out. If it's clean, your cake is perfectly cooked. If it's still wet, give it 2 minutes. Just keep checking back in 2-minute intervals. And after that, once they come out dry, we're going to remove our cakes and cut off the oven. Remove them out of the oven and sit them on a counter on racks so that they can cool. Right? As it states here, let cool on wire racks for at least 15 minutes, then flip each pan over onto the rack and tap gently all over. Lift the pan slightly. If the cake doesn't feel like it's falling out smoothly, lay a slightly damp kitchen towel over the pan and tap again. Now, why do I do that? Because we don't want the cake to break. Now, this recipe says 15 minutes. I say let your cake rest for 30 minutes. Because oftentimes you're coming out at 350 degrees, and we know that food continues to cook even when it's taken out of its element. So there's a potential that the cake is 360 degrees. Give it 30 minutes, let it cool down on the rack. Then I suggest to flip it over onto the rack to let it cool, and then remove the pan from the cake to separate and allow it to further cool. And this is key. Once we've removed the pan successfully, at the bottom of the bowl it says, cool completely, then frost and eat. This is where some of the errors are made. We do not allow the cake to cool thoroughly. And cool thoroughly is at least reduced down to about 50 degrees. Because if you add your frosting to a warm cake, what's going to happen? It's going to go south. It's not going to stick to your cake like you want it to be and look like your Sunday's best cake. So it's key. Allow the cake to cool, then ice it. So now we've thoroughly went through the nuts and bolts of how to make the cake. Now the second most important step is, what am I making? What's in it? A half a cup of unsalted butter, softened. Again, we've seen softened throughout the recipe more than once. So it doesn't say melt anywhere in the recipe. 1.5 cups of sugar. 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour. 1 teaspoon of salt. 3.5 teaspoons of baking powder. 1 1/4 cups of whole milk. 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And that's our shopping list. So, today we went over how to properly read and thoroughly go through a recipe and understand a recipe. All we have left to do is just prepare it. So, thank you for joining me today on Old Fashioned Help. Again, I'm Chef Jay, and I look forward to seeing you next week on our next episode. Be sure to catch us around, and don't forget, every bite matters.